all human beings share being born, living, and dying. Every single person who's ever been on this earth has had these experiences. And our cultures have grown not so well, and they're not so well with the ability to hold deep meaningfulness of these processes around dying. In addition, it's scary, and when we're younger, we belong living in innocence to some degree, although usually ancient cultures, you'd be initiated pretty quickly into the rounds of life and death. So it's amazing that it touches all of our lives, and that in the West, we're figuring out ways to wake up to the value and depth, power, difficulty, and also beauty that goes on in these transitions, and how to support each other, how to show up for each other.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the complex topic of how to face death. Now, I'm sure that some of you will have found this episode because you're facing death during this time, either your own or that of a loved one. And to those of you, I offer my condolences and my healing prayers, and I hope dearly that what we discuss here today will offer some perspective and assistance. And my apologies in advance if any of our ideas cause you pain. Death and mourning are extremely personal topics. But I also hope that many others of you are here simply to try and form a healthier relationship with death. So the inspiration for this episode came not only from my own experience facing my parents' mortality, but also from my intuition that our modern consumeristic, aesthetic, and individualistic society has made us more afraid of death than ever. Perhaps because of the post-scientific revolution's focus on material well-being and the power of technology to guarantee it, I don't know. But my gut feeling is that we need to face and become aware of this unconscious taboo, as it seems to be hindering a deeper and perhaps more wholesome acceptance of our mortality in general. So that's why I wanted to speak to a specialist, like my guest today, psychoanalyst Monika Wikman. Monika received her PhD in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology, and then qualified as a Jungian psychoanalyst at the Jung von Franz Center for Depth Psychology in Zurich. She's an expert on topics including archetypal phenomena surrounding death, also dreams, active imagination, and alchemy. Her work with the dying culminated in a research project called Dreams of the Dying at UC San Diego Medical Center, and she's also the author of the book Pregnant Darkness, Alchemy and the Rebirth of Consciousness. Now, I have wanted to speak to Monika about this since her work on death and near-death experiences came up in our first incredible interview, episode 6 on Jung's collective unconscious, which I highly recommend. Since then, the trickster has played havoc with us, and the interview has been postponed twice, in both cases because of a death of a close loved one, first from me and then from Monika. So all of that aside, let's say we're both well placed to offer some perspective on this issue. So without further ado, let's go. Monika Wikman, welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for returning for this important conversation. How are you today?
Thank you, Freddie, to have me back. I'm doing well. Good to see you.
Good. So we're going to launch straight in, listeners, because we had this amazing conversation last time where I got to ask my favorite first question about early thoughts. And I want to get straight into this because I'm sure a lot of listeners will have found this because they're dealing with death at the moment in their lives. Now, most of us don't think much about death when we're young, except maybe from a fleeting moment here or there when we lose a special pet or a grandparent. Of course, there are exceptions. And as we get older, we start to encounter closer friends and family dealing with unexpected illnesses or accidents. And eventually we confront old age related issues, both with partners and with parents. So I guess I just wanted to start there, Monica, just being there for those we love as they face those deepest fears. What can we say about the best way to just be there for those people? And how does it change us to be around that?
Such a perfect first question. It's astounding the archetypal reality that all human beings share being born, living, and dying. Every single person who's ever been on this earth has had these experiences. And our cultures have grown not so well, and they're not so well with the ability to hold deep meaningfulness of these processes around dying. In addition, it's scary, and when we're younger, we belong living in innocence to some degree, although usually ancient cultures, you'd be initiated pretty quickly into the rounds of life and death. So it's amazing that it touches all of our lives, and that in the West, we're figuring out ways to wake up to the value and depth, power, difficulty, and also beauty that goes on in these transitions, and how to support each other, how to show up for each other. Well, we know that hospice has just been astounding, development in the last few decades. And it's an amazing training, of course, that the hospice people go through. Now there's death doulas also. But the point is that all of us participate both in dying and also supporting the dying and being present for the dying. And when we do that, the amount of growth that happens in us. Uh, so there's so much to be said there, Freddie. I guess it's tricky. I guess I think about a poem that Wendell Berry wrote. It's an excerpt from a poem of his called Rising. And what he's looking at is that when somebody dies, that we could just say goodbye to the person at the grave, but then he gets into the fact of, wow, how death informs us, and the powerful way it's that it's really not just a singular person who's dying. It's the story of life and lives knit together, overlapping in succession, and that the human being is rising from grave after grave after grave. And he looks through the poetic eye that we're the value of the process of dying and how death affects us. In it, he says, for those who depart from the grave, they burying it in their minds, then the grave is a beginning. So for the dying person, he's saying it's a beginning. And then he's back to that it has weighted the earth with sudden new gravity, the enrichment of pain. There's a grave too in each survivor. By it, the dead one lives. So he's getting at the fact that once we go through a death process, we have the whole reality, alchemical, symbolic, figurative, experiential reality in us of death, and also the grave or ashes, that these are archetypal experiences that each person is busy metabolizing, getting close to, and digesting, and its effects on us are enormous because it teaches us, of course, the value of life. It teaches us the value of love. It takes us through the rounds of what's important. We wake up in the presence of it. And everyone knows who's been through the death of a loved one that there's the love, there's the grief that takes us through the processes around regret, what happened in the life or didn't happen. It has a quickening effect in us too, of wanting to wake up more, to be present more in our lives for ourselves and each other. So it's an awakening at the bottom and a movement toward a deeper quality of love and life. And it challenges us all to grow.
Yeah. Well, a lot of those points we're coming back to, listeners. So,
Yeah.
presumably, to be fully present and supportive for others, we need to have somehow faced, to some extent, our own mortality. In ancient cultures, we have a long tradition of conscious dying. I think the ancient Egyptian tradition is the one you tend to talk most about, Monica. What is conscious dying, and how did the Egyptians, among other ancient cultures, approach this dying consciously?
Well, this question is like a springboard into like a life of rich exploration for everyone who's interested in this question. Because if we look at every culture, we see the roots of every culture have been absolutely metabolizing the archetypal experience of death and integrating it and showing us what comes in the process and what the insights are. So if we go to Zen Buddhism, we have extraordinary experiences of the wheel of death and the body of light that's also seen at death. We'll get into that, I know, later in our conversation. But the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, of course, it's there in Christian tradition too, the mystical tradition. You have Mary Magdalene with Jesus moving through the mysteries of death and the resurrection body. That's also present in the Sufi tradition around the resurrection body, often called the glorified body. The Taoists call it the diamond body. There's an emergent mythic presence that comes through and shows us how we make the passage out of life through a significant energy that forms, which is the subtle body. Now, we all have the subtle body, and we're going to get further into this later, but let me just at least name it, because every one of these traditions are showing us inroads into that mystery. And so everywhere we look, we see it. Now, Hinduism, we cannot leave without mentioning Hinduism, of course. And, Eliade's book, Mircea Eliade's book on yoga and immortality is loaded with the beauty of that tradition and its consciousness raising realities and the mysteries that open at death of the eternal self. So lots of great research that people can pick up. But that book particularly, I'd have to say, is a gem. When it comes to Egyptian culture, I've just been particularly attracted to it. I've been to Egypt a number of times. It shows up through my dreams. Later on, I'll tell the story of a dream I had of Osiris that shows that mythic structure at work in a death rebirth process. So I guess maybe it's important to just note that, the earlier people for millennium had a mythic consciousness and a mythic capacity, mythic awareness, that would alert them to the paradoxical nature of life and death. So they have a mythical framework that they used, that they could experience life, death, and also all the opposites between order and disorder. So and so when we go to look at Egypt, for example, we're just looking at their mythical relationship of understanding, relatedness to life and death and the mysteries of life and death. So I guess I'll just mention something there. I know it's used psychologically, and it is psychospiritual, the reality of dismemberment and rememberment. So where we've had, the mythical understanding from millennium that really went up to the formation, I think, of the Renaissance, then when rational science takes off. And when rational science takes off, it tries to, snuff out the mythological, but of course the mythological keeps coming back because it's our bedrock. And it has its own archetypal truths in it. And of course, science has gone way beyond the Newtonian model now, thank God, so it doesn't have to have it leave. In other words, what comes in through these world religions and the shamanic depths of the psyche are real for us in our own lives, and it shows up in dreams. And this is where, of course, we want to see how the psyche is informing a death process for each person. So where do the dreams come from? And it's nice to know these different traditions because we recognize the mythologems that are at work as the psyche is making a transformative process. So now, getting to the chase, sorry, with Egypt, there is the powerful, potent myth of Osiris. And Osiris is a vegetation deity who has to undergo the death and rebirth mysteries. And there's many levels to this deity in the myth, but when he has to go through the dismemberment, there's the beauty of the feminine principle of Isis, who she combs with her wings, she combs the landscape of Egypt everywhere to gather together his dismembered parts. Now, when she gathers together the dismembered parts, this whole myth is, mirroring to us the value of death and rememberment. And rememberment is key. Now, every psychological process we go through, every psychological death process we go through involves dismemberment and rememberment. It involves a disorder and then a new order coming in. So since it's each individual who dies, each individual has to find a way to get connected to where that process is alive, informing them. And in the Egyptian story, it's very beautiful because there's a feminine force in the psyche that is gathering together the dismembered parts and she has her temple at the heart of in Philae, where it's the heart of Osiris and around which everything else organizes. So if we listen to that myth, you see we catch that there's a feminine organizing principle in the death rebirth processes that is bigger than the ego. And that feminine presence knows that through the heart field, a dismembered being, a dismembered culture, a dismembered process will get reorganized if it comes in through the heart field. Around that beautiful green living heart of Osiris, like the green Hermes emerald tablet stone, Hermes Trismegistus, then the whole psyche gets reorganized. And then the new comes in, and then the new lovemaking comes in. Actually, there's even a new phallus that grows out of it, a new lovemaking and a new unity that then transpires. So now that's true in a psychological death, that we go through symbolic death in our lifetimes. We can feel those forces at work. We'll get into that later. And we can feel those forces also at work at death. Something's also dismembering us and unifying us into the wedding, to a union state, which is archetypally true in each of these cultures, and it shows up in the psyche again and again, is the archetypal motif of the divine wedding. The opposites marry. So anyway, that's a little sprinkling of the myth of Egypt. We'll get to it.
It is very much just the beginning, isn't it? And there are so many of these myths in so many cultures that have, useful symbology for us to draw on if we're interested. Now, it seems to me that a lot of these traditions had honored their elders much more than we do.
Yes.
We often shun the responsibility of assisting them in their physical difficulties of old age in favor of a nursing home or live-in help. Sometimes
Yeah.
we encourage a hospital death over a death at home, but we rarely speak about their wisdom or importance to the community.
Yeah.
What have we lost from our elder traditions that could prove useful on this mission of sort of restoring death to its rightful place in the circle of life?
Ooh, there's so much energy in what you said. I can just feel it in my feet. Um, this is the impoverishment of Western culture. It really is the impoverishment, and it is the archetype of the puer that's taken over Western culture, the value of youth and the value of achievement and success, and all that first arc of life of the achievements of the ego. And of course, Jung's psychology is all what the second half of life's about, actually. Jung speaks about, death as a goal, and, that it's achieving something. So not only would we turn toward respecting our elders and what they have to give us, but respecting the processes they're in while we serve those processes to bring it themselves to a fulfillment. So much is happening in aging and dying in that whole second arc of life as we make the necessary sacrifices. The ability for the ego to really find the greater self and the center and really get into a unified relationship with it so that consciousness has changed. So the ego sits in the lap of the self, sits into the greater reality. It tunes into the archetypal Atman, to the cosmic human being. And this is true from every tradition, and it's true in people's dreams when they have no sense of myth or religion and never did. And then you see it. And I've loved actually seeing that in dying people where they love to say, I'm not a believer. And this is not about belief, by the way. I'm all about not being a believer because when you believe in something, then you reify a belief. And what we're talking about here is the phenomenology. So in the phenomenology of death and dying, and the phenomenology what happens to older people, we can tune in with respect to what's going on in the darkness that's very sacred. In the losses that go on, what's getting born? What are the dreams showing? What are the insights that are coming? What's the new awareness? Now, I know, for example, people are used to at this point the reality that at death we sometimes get a terminal lucidity. Something wakes up in a dying person and it speaks super clearly, and they're powerful and it's eerie. But see, that phenomenon is revealing to us what elders are going through, that something's crystallizing and a wisdom is growing. And so we want to learn to facilitate that, respect it, and then enjoy the fruit of it, being around people who are dying, because it affects our lives. It nourishes our lives. I think this is what I'm getting at with Wendell Berry's poem, is that the grave it becomes a nourishing presence, that everything the person goes through, it goes into the ground of being in those of us who are around them, and we're nourished. We change the way we live. We want to. So in other words, yes, Freddie, the respect for elders, a whole cultural reality revolution around this is happening, and it's been going on for a long time. I mean, we saw a lot of it in the 70s, of course, with Ram Dass and the death movement that was happening in San Francisco. And then, now we are here so much later, and we have people are doing death doula trainings who never planned to be a formal death doula serving as a paid practitioner. They're doing it for themselves and their family members. It's fantastic. We
And
have death cafes.
a death
Yeah,
jeweler?
yeah, death doulas. The death doulas are like a birth doula, and we do consider it a successful home birth when someone dies at home. that something's busy getting born while something's busy dying.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a bit the opposite of what Dylan said. If you're not busy born, then you're busy dying. Well, this is reverse. If you're busy dying, something's trying to be born. And so the death duel is no, it's a birth process also that's going on, and how to facilitate that. I'll give examples of that later on in our conversation. But a lot's getting born in older reality and older people. So the wisdom, there's a presence. Why do we love grandparents, for example? When grandparents have had enough life experience and they're not in the rushing first arc of life, dropping into presence and embodiment, appreciating the young, the love gets exchanged between a grandparent and a small child. That energy field is absolutely coming from the wisdom of life integrated. So yes, we need our elders, and ancient traditions and indigenous traditions, can be honored and felt. We can, we're closer to that than we are to AI. We should really get this, right? We want to draw on our roots of indigenous culture, and we want to stay close to it. We want to stay closer to nature, get closer to nature as this other reality is coming into the psyche, and doing it through death. It's a big way it happens. Think about what happened. I know I'm saying so much, but I'll just stop with this. But think about what happened during COVID. What about when all of us saw the images coming out of your beloved Italy? I mean, it was a shock what was coming to us all on screens worldwide. So what happened? It just disappeared the boundaries between cultures. We were unified for a moment across the world with humanity, the archetypal truth. We all die, and we're all threatened when something of this nature comes in. And of course, now we have global warming and many other things that threaten. That should make a universal felt sense and have us quicken toward life. So death informs, and the aging have lots to give us. We want to support them. Long-winded story. Sorry, Freddie.
Absolutely not, Monica. And please don't hold back. This is going to be very much a free association. You've got a lot of experience that's relevant here. So please, whatever comes up, feel free to say it. Doesn't matter how long it takes. Now, you mentioned what the Hindus speak about there, about this second part of adult life before death that should concentrate less on matters of material wealth, of sustaining children and a household, and more on matters of spiritual development or soul searching or fulfillment of one's purpose, similar to what Jung called individuation. So, in view of this phases of life experience approach, could we see death as the ultimate transformative step in Jung's individuation process, this final letting go of ego consciousness?
I was I gave some talks in Zurich a few years back on death and dreams, and I was so moved by in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections how much Jung gets into trying to help us wake up as readers, as human beings, to participate in our own relationship with our own mythos toward death. So he was a proponent of everyone incubating their own egg of awareness around life and death, and to pay attention in an inward way through dreams and such. And so he says, he says, since the unconscious, as the result of its spatial temporal relativity, possesses sources better of information than the conscious mind, which has only sense perceptions available to it, we're dependent for our myth of life after death upon the eager hints of dreams and similar spontaneous revelations from the unconscious. So it's very important for us to really get how much Jung knew as he watched the Aquarian age coming in. He kept warning us that the polarity would be extremely important, or the fusion with collective consciousness would just take over, and we would lose the transformative properties of the psyche. And he said the polarity is the value of the individual human soul. And so an individual human at death, and each of us, he's saying every person needs their own mythos of connection to what death means to them, and to stir up your own experience to find it out. And he was a phenomenologist, again, not a believer. So everybody has their own phenomena. So agnostics, atheists, believers alike, everybody finding their own relationship with death is busy happening, and something is busy getting born while that's happening. But the dreams and the spontaneous revelations that come, he speaks of life as ongoing revelation. And so that turn inward to see the hints that are coming from dreams is key. So that Memory Streams Reflections is loaded with encouraging us all to pick up our own relationship to life and death. Now, people's dreams will do this. And from early on in life, they'll do it. They'll try to help us get a ground where our life also includes the reality of dying. And it brings in a harmony when we start to get it. So this is going to wander into, of course, Jung's concept of the subtle body and symbolic death. I know I can feel it. I can feel it coming, because what he's getting at too is the way that we learn a relationship to death is through symbolic death. And if we pick up a relationship to symbolic death, then the literal dying we're already there. And so maybe you were headed there.
Well, that is my next question, and
Okay.
I imagine Jung often used the concept of symbolic death.
Mhm.
I suppose the allegory is to allowing the old to pass in order to make way for the new, something you've mentioned several times already. How did Jung use this concept, and how useful is it for us to make transformations while we're still alive? Because I know Jung talked about that after his near-death experience, this sort of quickening, this need to get on with it while you still can.
But yes, so what he's looking at with that, there's a call inside each individual, which he calls individuation, of course. But really, what is individuation but a quickening of something? Like, think about the sperm and the ovum, meeting at the moment of conception and, coming into life and the formation of human being and then eventually dying. That inside that, Jung is saying it's an incarnational psychology. He's talking about that the soul incarnates and the soul departs. So in incarnating into life, what is the soul's intention and what is it's here to learn, to do, to grow, to become? What is its unfolding? And individuation shows that. But we can't do individuation if we don't get down symbolic death. So I'll just tell you a couple things on symbolic death that I think are so important. In a letter that he wrote to David Cox in 1957, he said, "We're threatened with universal genocide unless we can work out the way of salvation by a symbolic death." Okay, then if you look at also, Martin Luther King is saying something similar when he says, America must re-examine old presuppositions and release itself from many things that for centuries have been held sacred. For the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism to die, a new set of values must be born. So they're both prescribing a revolution. And the revolution, uh, Jung speaks about every person needs an inner revolution. And what he's looking at is the inner revolution means that it's going to be the throwing over of the existing values and finding what the deeply individual way is inside each person. But to do that, he's saying that to do that, you can only, for individuation, uh, that leads to possible collective change. He didn't believe that collective change at a collective level was where he would focus. He would focus on it in the individual, that would change the collective unconscious. It would change the collective as well. Now, I mean, of course, both are true, but he was focused on this. So he writes that it's only experienced by those who've gone through the wearisome but indispensable business of coming to terms with the unconscious components of the personality. So symbolic death, individuation, means that we'll have to come into relationship with these difficult other parts of the personality. And he's getting at, of course, is the multiplicity in the psyche of everyone. And if you look at the Red Book, it's all about the multiplicity of Jung. And he's suggesting if we do an inner world journey, we'll take a descent, we will get to know the ego's light will be relativized, and we will get to know other lights that are inside the complexes and other sides of personality, and we'll learn where the presence of the greater self is that's trying to make a new organization of self. See, and that's trying to happen in individuation and in the symbolic deaths we do along the way. And that's absolutely what's trying to happen at death, is that the ego's light starts to dim. It sees the larger psyche and it can feel the greater presence of the eternal. And it can come into a felt relationship to it in a way that's extremely moving and helpful in the passage. And something gets created in the passage, both during our symbolic death and also in our ultimate death. But the courage to face the multiplicity and go through the many symbolic deaths, is what each of us have to do. Now, it comes in every doorway in our lives. We don't have to go looking for it. But if we do introvert, we'll find it immediately. But Jung talks about in a way that I find amazing. He talks about everyone should have a last supper, should celebrate a last supper with themselves. He's saying that that if we're sitting at that last supper, see your death and take a look at who are sitting around your table, who are the components of your own psyche. So, for example, the vanities that we can have, or the way a certain part of our life takes off and it's not the direction that the soul or the body wants. or or a relationship that's out of balance, whatever. If we sit at the round table with ourselves, we will see what needs our attention, that the ego must pay attention to create a new alignment, a new centered new organization. This gets us to that line of, from the Egyptian reality about what's organizing the psyche. Something larger wants to organize the psyche. In a symbolic death experience, we get in touch with a presence that knows how to do that if we will die, if we'll surrender, if we'll sacrifice the ego attitude.
Well, many great thinkers have alluded over the centuries that the most challenging experience in life can often be the greatest teachers. Rumi famously, for example, said, "The wound is where the light enters you." So, Monica, is it true that people's experiences with death, no matter how harrowing, can open up a contact with something larger, perhaps even eternal, as you mentioned, and shed new light on meaning in their lives? Is that universal?
Yes, it's archetypal and it's universal, and it's not for people who are even looking for it. It's just the archetypal structure of the psyche. It is archetypal reality, that there is greater consciousness. It's interesting. You get into, this piece, Donald Hoffman. I don't know if you've listened to him much or not. He's quite interesting anyway,
He's
where
been on
he's
the
getting
show.
at.
He's been on the show.
Oh, has he?
Fantastic.
Oh, wonderful. I'll have to
Fantastic
tune in.
interview, listeners, if you haven't checked it.
Oh, it's fun. I'm sorry. I listened to him. But you know how he is getting at the fact that we don't have to look to time space as what's organizing reality. We look to consciousness as what's organizing reality. So if it's consciousness that's organizing reality, then you see the ego is on for quite an adventure, because it's not the ego that's the good organizer in the psyche. There's an organizing principle alive in the psyche that if the ego does these deaths, it will tune into. And then we get into the presence of the divine. Now Jung gets that there is the divine is present in every complex that a human being has. Because at the center of every archetype, is the divine energy. It's an archetypal, eternal presence. It's at the center of everything. So if you go through a symbolic death, you will contact, to whatever degree, you will contact something of the greater self, and it does bring healing, alignment, well-being, a new co-regulation between the ego and a larger presence. We talk a lot about co-regulation these days of the nervous system. What's regulating the larger field, is, can we, in a process like death, can we tune into what is the psyche doing and where is the axis? And so, we think of the axis of every human body, and this is also another archetypal reality. It shows up in craniosacral work and osteopathy, Chinese medicine. It's everywhere in the world, and it's in every tradition. This is a fact that we know, that the human being is organized around a midline of energy. It's a neutral channel of energy. And so when we find that out, and we learn to live more from it, we're living from a meditative center. And this comes in when we go through symbolic death. And these world religions then boil down to being found in the individual. To me, this is very interesting, because if you think of what Jung was saying, he was saying that the heart of his work was religious function. And by that, he meant that we're learning to follow an instinct that knows better than the ego, how to develop a way, how to create a new way. So when we come into, for example, you mentioned the wound, it's perfect. How do we encounter these death process, symbolic death? Well, we come up against our wound and the impossible, where we can't go on in the same old way. And the wound, is a Chiron mystery. It's the wounded healer. Where we're wounded, we are also, it's the paradox, is where also the healing energy comes from. So it's also like the Grail cup. If we learn to have a container to hold the wound, then we learn to connect to what the greater intelligence is busy transforming. Von France, she says there's, that really that it's about the divine birthing itself and becoming alive in the soul of each individual. So if we hold close to the wound, then we find, and we're walking that path of symbolic death, where the ego surrendering to a process larger, and we are coming in contact with this greater presence. And when it organizes our lives and our families and our relationships, and it is an organizing principle that has a field phenomenon, and it affects people in a positive way. It's like a positive contagion. It organizes things from a sense of the eternal world joining with the temporal world. There's a unity between the eternal and the temporal when we're in the presence of this.
Hmm. Now, just coming back to a moment to Jung's near-death experience, which, as we both mentioned, is recounted beautifully in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Listeners, his work is very dense, so I really recommend this book, written with Anir Jaffe, I think it was. So it's much more accessible than his work, and it's a great, great introduction for anybody passionate like me who struggles with his collected works. Um, and he returned from that experience full of new purpose and understanding, like so many people who have NDEs. You too, Monica, have had several close deaths, calls with death. The first, which you recounted in our first interview in episode 6 on the collective unconscious, a quite extraordinary story of spontaneous remission from terminal cancers. Listeners, you must go back and listen to that episode. It's utterly fascinating and baffling. But the second experience of this kind, you recounted in your 2005 book, Pregnant Darkness, which you described as, quote, free falling into a great black darkness I went. I fell, and finally the darkness itself caught and held me. Now, the darkness here, I'm assuming, is a symbol of the unknown, our greatest fear in some sense. Can you tell us about this NDE and how, in your mind, this darkness is actually pregnant with great, great transformational potential, if only we can be brave enough just to face it?
Well, you're touching, I think, the central mystery in the psyche, because when we get a relationship to death and a relationship to surrender, because surrender is a very big part of the psyche. And I know those listeners of yours who are psychologically oriented, they may remember the beautiful article on masochism that was written around the fact that to find the way through masochism, you have to find what you're surrendering to. See, and so how do we get out of suffering? We get out of suffering by the connection to that, a connection to and a presence of and a trust in. See, it's not belief in, but it is trust. It's trust in the larger psyche. And that, as Ram Dass would say, dying is safe. So, and so when we go through a symbolic death or go through a near-death experience, we're trying to get a relationship with the darkness. And so our relationship to the darkness itself, you can see it change. And I'll get into the research on that later. It came up in my dream research. People's relationship to that pregnant darkness changes from cold, void, annihilation, because that's where it often starts for people, fear, and just annihilation. And then in a process of relatedness, something else starts to happen. And then the psyche knows how to personify itself and also create co-created fields of experience for a human being in a near-death experience, and then also in dying. So when I had that experience, it's interesting that you bring that up because it links to the Egyptian Osiris myth. So that time of pregnant darkness in my life, and if I guess let me say one thing here first. Every time the soul of all of us is going through hard times, we can get into a time where there's an incarnational choice point, where is the soul going to decide? Are we going to decide to stay and live? And have we made some changes in time? Sometimes it'll come in through the body, and it'll come in hard. Archetypal pressures of change, and societal things, marriage problems, all sorts of things that come in that are just so hard on a human organism, the body will break down. And so we often see that. And so in near-death experiences, very often we see the phenomenon where, the soul is instructed when it has the experience in the beyond that it's not time yet, it has to come back. It has to come back into life. And its mission is not done. Now, this again is not belief, it's archetypal. It happens to people of all cultures. So for me, in that near-death experience that I had, it was an incarnational choice point for me. A very meaningful marriage of 23-year partnership with a dear person who I love very much. I'm glad he's still alive, and we both survived loving and divorcing. But when we divorced, I got incredibly sick. And and that's when I had that experience of the falling into the black. And in that process, there was a time in it where I had a dream that was, this is why you want to watch dreams, right? So I'm telling you something about how the nature of this just emerged in my life, right? So I didn't know a physical crisis was coming. I knew my divorce had happened, and I came up to my cabin to do a ritual with my friend Diane. And that night I had a dream that Osiris wanted to meet me in a passage tomb in Egypt. Now, that's intense, right? So it is the Osiris deity. He's in the passage tomb. I'm walking down the passage tomb, and I can see at the bottom is the crypt. Now, this is just like the passage tombs of Egypt. And the reality of these passage tombs is that they would have the pharaoh's life story drawn onto the walls of the tomb, and that at the moment that the pharaoh is crowned, they begin the passage tomb. Now let's get that right. The moment the ego is crowned, we begin, and the ascent, we begin the descent. So this culture knew from the moment he's crowned, we're getting ready for the death. And we write the story in a descent because the story of the life is valuable. So they're writing the stories on the walls, and the moment the pharaoh dies, they stop right there. And then they have the crypt, and then the soul rituals begin at the bottom of the crypt for the soul too. This is so interesting, so that the boss soul can fly up as it leaves life from the bottom tomb and remember its life story and take that with it into the eternal world. So the boss soul can also visit, can come back and forth, but it's meant to remember the life story painted on the walls of the passage tomb. So in my near-death experience, not knowing it was coming, I had a dream that I was walking in the passage tomb and I could see my life story and where it stopped. Oh, wow, I made it this far, but now the walls are blank. And then Osiris comes up in the dream to hug me. Now, when he hugged me, it was a very profound hug. Now, the next day, I went into a life and death crisis, and my body became very sick. I ate food with a friend and got food poisoning. She was fine. I ended up in the emergency room. I ended up in a total crisis with the digestive tract, and clearly, it was the body showing that I couldn't metabolize the loss. That it hit me so fast I couldn't metabolize it. And that it was such a shock, the soul was trying to decide if it wanted to live. I was standing, so you get the dream, but it's informing that process. This is archetypally true for people, that there's an incarnational choice point, and the soul and personality are trying to reevaluate. Does my life go on from here? How would it be meaningful for my life to go on from here or not? And so there I was, not knowing if it was going to go on, and it became a real life and death dance for a number of months. And I had that experience that really transformed it at a deep feeling level, along with one other dream experience. But the falling into the black and where it becomes pregnant darkness is staying, knowing, listen, does my soul want to live and how? Now, everyone has, people aren't going to like hearing this, some people, but everyone has a relationship to the suicidal self. There is a side of us that does at certain times of darkness think maybe it's time to give it up, or I'd like to check out, or or even can have a propensity toward depressive pieces and wanting to leave life because life can be so hard. So that's true of every life. So in a life-death crisis that goes to near-death experiences, oftentimes there's an incarnational choice point, and the destruction of the old is so strong. Do you even want to live? So in that experience of the darkness, the feeling tone turned, and I knew I was held. The greater soul of the divine feminine, there was a presence in that blackness. And it was like, the archetypal images that we have of the Great Mother in the Black Madonna temples around the world. The Black Madonna is like the divine feminine in the darkness that feels compassion for all sentient beings. It's like Kuan Yin, of course, in the other traditions, where she's comes in so beautifully in Buddhism, where she says, I will reincarnate again and again until every blade of grass is redeemed. She is a sea of infinite compassion. And sometimes when the ego surrenders, it will find these archetypal presences are happy to come in to hold the little tiny soul. And then reorient. Is it time to go and then go without blame? Or is it time to stay? And then what would staying be like? So I think that's an archetypal universal pattern, very important. And see, it's interesting because we have Osiris, the dismembered one. Our lives get dismembered in a near-death experience, and we're meant to live in a different way. It's also a wake-up call when you get a near-death experience, because you're meant to live differently from your core in a different way. And the meaning of life switches and changes, and the forms change. But then life goes on, it rebirths itself. And that's the Egyptian knowing. That's the scorpionic archetype, too, of Pluto, or Shiva, in Hinduism. The destroy to create the new. So in near-death phenomenon, and when the soul's meant to come back, the old wants to be destroyed and a new way found. That we have to have the archetypal presence to help us find it. And it will give us a new basis for life. We feel it. It's an energetic presence that
So I
holds us.
know, I know that Jung was quite, because he was a phenomenologist over a believer, as you mentioned. I know that he tended not to make statements about things that he couldn't prove medically and scientifically. But did he have anything to say about the immortality of the human soul or the subtle body, which you mentioned, or did he remain agnostic about these things even after his near-death experience?
Well, now you're going to hear just my take on it, of course. Uh, he was so busy working so hard to be accepted as a scientist, and did a great job of it. And all the collected works, he worked hard, hard, hard. We see the Red Book and we catch the experiential depths of the mystical soul in him that was also inside the reality of his science. He was not wanting to be a metaphysician. He resisted that. So yet, when it comes to the reality of the immortal, let me just tell you a little piece here I had. Yeah, so this comes from Jung's writing on Seven Sermons of the Dead. It's from the seventh sermon. And he says, prayer increases the light of the star. It casts a bridge across death. We'll take a minute on this. Prayer increases the light of the star. It casts a bridge across death. What he found was, and it is archetypally true, the star, Rouland, medieval alchemist, spoke about the star is the living imagination in human beings. So the star is connection to the living imagination. Now we're back to Blake, right, and Swedenborg, the roots of Jung, of course. And so the marriage of heaven and earth, the marriage of heaven and hell, the marriage of opposites that Blake was working on, Jung just built on the foundation of all that, really. I mean, Freud was kin to him, but he was built on another foundation that was, this foundation. So the star, now it's important about the star because everyone has their own relationship to the living imagination, and they can get a relationship to their own star. Here Jung is saying prayer, meaning meditative consciousness, reflective consciousness, he could locate his star, and it threw a bridge across death, meaning it linked him to the immortal, eternal world. And it's true for all of us, and it's true in my life, and many of us have experienced this, that the imagination is a living field phenomenon that connects us with souls who've also died. And so Jung knew this, and he watched this happen. He watched many people recover from near-death experiences, and he would always say how the dead wanted to know the story that you're living. Like, come with the story and tell us, how did it go? So Jung had, even though he wouldn't walk around saying I'm a metaphysician, he was deeply connected to the eternal world and to also souls having some form of consciousness, mysterious to us all, that goes on after death.
And did
Now,
his narrative change after the near death experience? Because I know his whole way of doing life was radically different, wasn't it?
well, yes, and also it was so hard for him to return, if you recall, to especially the last one that includes the divine wedding. He got so far into the connection to the infinite world that to return and live in the immortal world was very, very hard for him to do. And then he died not too long after that. But he saw into the archetypal truths. And see, this is also where my research went, was I was interested in exactly what he saw about the marriage. Because in his near-death experience, he participates in the divine wedding. And the ecstasy of the opposites marrying, the ecstatic hum of the unification of worlds, where we no longer see, the world in duality or split. Now we're all working on non-duality, but this is you're living in the center of it. So the birth of third eye and crown, the crown consciousness, and he was definitely a proponent that the dreams inform the ongoing reality. He didn't want to stay in the way of how dreams in all of us are informing us about the nature of the eternal world and connection to the ancestral world and the land of the dead. Because dreams do what he said, they go beyond time space. And so they inform us of an eternal reality that you get a felt sense of. So Jung definitely did. And of course, one of his last dreams ever recorded was so meaningful. And he knew when he had the dream that a many could die. And that was that he saw in the other world that Bollingen had been built. He saw his home is in the eternal world, in its eternal energetic form. And when he saw it there, he knew that he could leave this life. So he had a definite felt sense of ongoing existence after his life, and of course connection to to the Atman, to cosmic human being. Now, von Franz was great with this. I hope that, let's see here. I've got it somewhere. Yeah, here you go.
What a treat, listeners, that Monika always brings with her extraordinary collection of incredibly poignant quotes. Thanks again, Monika, for your time looking those up and having them read.
Oh, I'm so happy to. So here's something from Jung and then something from von Franz, so I think fit in perfectly here. So Yeah, so Jung is talking about, we have to get limited, we have to feel once we deal with the polarity of mortality and limitation, then we can feel and truly get into an experience of the eternal world and to the infinite. And it's only through limitation. He really keeps underlining this. So, in other words, not through inflation. If we identify with these greater presences, we leave our human mortality and we get into an inflated state and it doesn't work. And of course, we dim the light too much, the regulation of the flame, we dim it too much and we're just lost in the way of the world and we've lost connection to the eternal. But the whole point of incarnation is for the ego to connect to this greater self and to these greater states of consciousness that go on ad infinitum. Um, so, and interestingly, he sees the opposites, they energize each other together. We don't want to get off the line of the opposites, he says, because they create if we hold the connection of the opposites, like life and death or difficult times with hope, so he says here that the opposites, we often see the ascent and descent motifs appearing. And he says this corresponds to the vacillating energies between the opposites. And we can even get tossed back and forth. Like if you're in a death process, I'm dying. Oh God, I want to live, but I'm dying. So you're relating to death, you're relating to life. And both instincts are going. And sometimes it's very confusing until some kind of peace is made that will only come from being tossed among the opposites until something new emerges. And Jung says that we get tossed between these opposites until they become a vessel in which what was previously one thing now floats vibrating. There becomes a vibrational energy, a vibrational medicine, so that the painful suspension between these opposites gradually changes into a bilateral activity at the center. It's a bilateral point at the center of the opposites. You see, that's what gets born at death. That the opposites are no longer throwing us around, and we don't wait to do that, right? It's inside our lives from the beginning. It's in meditation. It's in every practice that we'd ever pick up. That the opposites stop throwing us around, and they find with our participation, they find that center, that new center that vibrates at the center. Now that's the subtle body, and the development of that new center of consciousness is what he was after. And that is what informs us to live our lives from that center. And it's what it takes us through death as well. And von Franz, just to finish this, she says, the ego is a part of the whole and at the same time one with the whole. It is just this relationship between the ego and the self with Jungian depth psychology attempts to establish in each analysand during his or her lifetime. So she's saying the hope for anyone individuating is that we find the relationship of the ego becoming part of this greater whole. It's the unus mundus the alchemists were talking about. Here she says, for if the ego identifies with the self, it will suffer inflation. If it goes too far from the self, it will sink into wishing, hoping, fearing, desiring, and it will get lost in the world. So we get back to that the achievement of that vibrating center is where the ego is at home, resting in the presence of the greater self of the Atman. And of course, to do that, it's no end of releasing old identities, releasing old constructs within the psyche that don't serve us. The old defense structures have to die, all the old cells have to die. And a beautiful piece, if anyone wants to pick it up, is the Persian fairy tale that von Franz gets into. This is a story about the diamond body where the hero has to shoot in the castle. It's called the Castle of Non-Existence. So he's sent to that castle. You may know the fairy tale, it's marvelous. But anyway, in the fairy tale, there's a moment where he has to shoot this parrot while he's twirling around on something, an impossible feat. And he has 3 tries, he blows it twice. And on the third one, he stops trying to calculate and he just takes his arrow and he asks God for help. And when he does that, when he asks the divine for help, that arrow shoots the parrot. See, now this is important because it shows that something deeper in the structures of the psyche, there's a place where the aim is true, where the ego doesn't even know how the aim is true, right? That hero in that myth, he has to say, I can't calculate it. I can't shoot this damn thing to get rid of the false self. The parroting that she talks about, the parrot, all the false selves, the ego doesn't do it. It has to rely on a connection and ask for help from the transcendent. Then the aim is true, and then the old selves can die. And then, of course, what he discovers in the myth is the diamond body. It's that energetic center that Jung's looking at, that vibrating center of wholeness. So, so in this transformational process, the subtle body is a transcendental concept of what lives beyond psyche and matter. It unites psyche and matter, and it takes the ego's participation. But the ego's participation, as you can see, is a ton of surrender, emptying, letting go of old structures, asking the divine and the transcendent for help so that the aim can be true, so that this new incarnating center can happen. And that's the creation of the subtle body that all these world religions have been working on forever. And it's heightened now because in these death doula processes, people are getting interested in near-death experiences and death reality. We will all walk into how we can facilitate this with each other because it's present at death. This mystery wants to happen. It'll help the ego let go of everything and rest in something greater. It happened to my partner, Tom Elsner, when he died in January. Went through a year-long death process that was exactly that mystery. A very beautiful, terrible, and deeply, profoundly beautiful to witness and help someone in that process to live in that union state. And that's what Jung was getting at in his near-death experience with the union states. So I'll tell you one thing, for example, when Tom died, and it has a piece of this in it. It's touching about 3 days after Tom died, and it was a deeply meaningful death process, to say the least. The real creation of the energetic presence of the subtle body in his process. Astounding. I'm so gifted and graced to have been with him in the creation of that. So about 3 days after he died, I dreamt that our giant dog Kublai is a giant Marmaduke mutt. He's sitting on my lap in the dream, and he weighs about 98 pounds. I'm like, God, Kublai, you're so heavy. And I had a portal open above my head in the dream, and Kublai was pointing his nose through the open portal. He wanted me to see something. So in the dream, I looked up, and there was the divine tree, a wedding tree. And it was the energetic tree that went on ad infinitum into the eternal world. And I mean, ad infinitum, I could only see so far, but it was clear. It just went on for dimension after dimension after dimension. And it was wedding of opposites. And every soul who ever died found their place in the wedding tree. And there was Tom. I could see him. He was in a lower branch off to the left. I could see his divine wedding taking place. And the ecstasy and the light coming out of Tom's divine wedding was so beautiful and so comforting. And so you see, for us being around people who die, we watch our dreams because we see into the eternal world. It wants to show us, and it wants to help us feel the phenomenon of what's being created and also have us make peace and a feeling of peace. And also continual relatedness can come in with people who have died. We can get to that perhaps in another whole podcast.
Yeah, we may need one.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. So personal, Monica. So useful for the listeners. I just want to stay with this contact with the eternal at death for a moment, because this veil between spatiotemporal and non-spatiotemporal worlds, as it becomes porous, Jung noticed the dying and those around the dying started to experience more synchronicities than usual. Synchronicities, which, according to Jung, are meaningful coincidences of two or more events where something other than the probability of chance is involved. Now, listeners, we do have an excellent devoted episode on synchronicity from the director of the C.G.Jung Institute in Los Angeles, also a quantum physicist, Christophe Lemuel. Thank you, Monica, for that amazing hookup. Fascinating interview. Do check that out, listeners. You too, Monica, have countless personal and client encounters with this. What type of synchronicities had Jung noticed around the dying, and why are they significant and perhaps different from other synchronicities?
Well, it's interesting. We have that line of Jung's about the star throws a bridge across death. So everyone's relationship to the living imagination bridges life and death. And so what happens in a synchronicity is, since synchronicity is another state of consciousness, it's not ordinary ego consciousness. It's not the time, space, workaday world of the ego. It's coming in from the unified world. That's what synchronicity is. It's, of course, it's the landscape, of where the temporal and the eternal actually meet. So what happens at death is that so many of these pour in the door, and they're nourishing. They're nourishing for the person dying, and they're nourishing for those who will live. And they are innumerable. It's astounding. And some of them happen in that immediacy that I mentioned, that lucidity that can happen, that terminal lucidity that can happen for people. Synchronicities happen there that are very concentrated. I want to make sure I mention something of that. I guess I'll give you one of those first, and then we'll get into other synchronicities.
Yeah, do it straight away so we don't forget.
Okay. Okay, good. So terminal lucidities are so beautiful that, if we're tending someone else's death process, we want to make room for the phenomenology and create a space where that can be seen, felt, heard. Anything a dying person is doing, what they're dreaming, what they're saying, record it, write it down, be a good scribe, attune to the process. It's amazing what you can help co-create if you do that. And I've always told people, it doesn't matter if you're not an analyst, it's not the point, or even if you even know dreams, because the dreams hold the medicine. You just record the dreams, hear the dreams, hear what people are saying. They penetrate, they go through. So everyone can pick up that work, and it is so deeply meaningful. So when a client that had worked with me for a very long time, and then she stopped working with me for a number of years, and she was in a death process, and I went to see her. This was about 8 months ago. I went to see her in her hospital bed where she was. She'd been in a coma state, not talking. And a nurse was in the room. And when I walked in, she sits right up and she knows exactly who I am. And she says to me, which was totally shocking, "I know why you came." And the nurse went, "What?" And the nurse, perks up and comes over to stand with the two of us. And I don't say anything, of course. And I'm in shock too, because I know she'd been in a coma. I just touch her hand and she said, "You came to open the portal. And I want to tell you, when time is right, it's going to be easy climb out of here." And with that, she closed her eyes, went back into her coma, and she died within 24 hours. But she was an intuitive type with a very good relationship to the subtle body. And so something in her energetically felt me, knew, but she claimed her own medicine. Like I wasn't doing any of that, right? I mean, I could stand for that for her for sure, but she had that awareness in herself and that lucidity. She set up to name what she was going to do, that she was going to find the open portal and she was going to have an easy climb out. And she did. She had a very gentle, easy death 24 hours later. And I feel her in the field. You can feel these deaths in form and the presence can stick around. So, uh, so I'll tell you a synchronicity that came with Tom's death. It was very deeply meaningful. So while Tom had cancer, it was stage 4, and of course everywhere, and we were, working with the dreams and praying that something else might come. But he was hit by profound archetypal forces of astrological transits were just so much and too much. His body psyche was never very strong. My body's rather robust. Tom's just never really was. So anyway, there was Tom with his more light, reminds me of Blake's line, "We are so lightly here." And it's true, Blake's right. We are a soul so lightly here. Even though our lives can have so much gravitas and meaning and importance and all the rest, we are lightly here. So Tom was in this encounter, dealing with the dreams and all. And I went outside to water the plants outside in our California nest at the time. And I was watering plants and I had this fresh thought. What is my contribution to Tom and the cancer? How could I look in and see what of mine? How could I help clear the field? I was having that thought. And as I'm having that fresh thought, it was coming not from a moralistic place. It was really coming from my heart. And when it happened, immediately this giant red-orange dragonfly flew up right in front of my heart. I was just and sat there, and I was watering, going, "I don't believe this is happening." If I'd had a phone, I could have filmed it. It went on for 7 minutes. It went from my heart to the hose to take a drink, back to my heart. It kept going back and forth, back and forth. And the hum and the vibration of the wings. And then suddenly it brought in an altered state experience for me. Its wings humming so loudly, I could feel the oneness of my energy field going into that vibrational frequency that Jung's talking about. Went into a vibrational frequency at one with this creature living in front of my heart. And suddenly all of nature was one with the dragonfly and me and the garden hose and Tom's cancer. And it was the oneness. It's so ecstatic. It's what the alchemists would call the unus mundus. It was real drink from that eternal oneness right in the present moment that held everything. And it was so clear, live or die. This is the field that holds life and death. And that's present in the heart field. And it's accessible to Tom. And I knew what the psyche was telling me is, stay in connection with that center and bring that energy into Tom's process more and more and help him live from it. So, of course, I tell him the experience. We go to the doctor's appointment. He's standing out in front of the medical fountain, and a dragonfly comes up and lands right here on his chest. We just went, oh my God. So then we're at the memorial. And nobody knows yet in the memorial that at the end of it, I was going to talk about the dragonfly experience. Nobody knows this, right? So we're going through all the speakers at the memorial service, and his two beautiful sons are sitting there along with the partner of one of his sons. The three of them are sitting there front row. A dragonfly. As I get up to talk, I sit down, a dragonfly comes. It lands on his son's nose, Bennett's nose. It lands on the nose. And then we saw it land. I was like, oh my God. So, okay, that's enough. Nope. Then it goes over and it lands on his other son's heart. Then it moves around the girlfriend. It comes up onto the stage. It zooms around me, the musician. It goes over to an image we have of the Midsummer's Eve, Shakespeare's Midsummer's Eve, that beautiful image of Titania, the fairy petting the face of the donkey. It goes over there. It comes back to Bennett and Jake and me, and then it is gone. And that was an amazing synchronicity. Of course, then moments later, these two young men are reading the story of the dragonfly as part of their piece. So that's the synchronicity of nature. And of course, also the heart vibrational field of the eternal world. And then, and even as tragic as it is, and believe me, I mean, my God, I'd do anything if it could have been different for Tom. But the eternal world is making a vibrational connection post-death in the heart field. And it's bringing it into an organized state where the other people are there too, right? So see, the psyche is the transcendent function that organizes the field when we attune through the heart. And so we've learned this a long time, but we keep learning it. Why? Because this heart field, like the Sufis see it, and so synchronicities often come when we love someone, because they can come because we're open to the heart field where synchronicities live. The Sufi saw the heart as the seat of the imagination, the hima. They literally see a throne where the divine sits on a throne in the heart field. So the eternal one in all of us, when we move to the heart, moves out of the ego, moves out of the mind. You know, we learn through meditation that the mind is not home, the emotional body is not home, but the neutral channel that lives through the heart field is actually home for consciousness to rest in. So it also, synchronicities will bring us energies of medicine too, of many more synchronicities. I don't know if you have room for more, but I could go on.
Well, I'd like to connect it with your research into the dreams of the dying, which you mentioned briefly, because in some sense, it's really connected to the synchronicity
Yes.
phenomena.
Yes.
This is your study of more than 1,500 dreams of the dying, which you conducted at the University of California, San Diego. It was highly influenced by one of your great inspiration, Marie-Louise
Yeah.
work on the dreams of the dying too. Can you just tell us about this research and, in retrospect, what light it's shed for you on death in general?
Well, you know, it's so wild to consider anyone's path in life, you know, and when you bring this up, I feel my own path in life. How did my life go through having stage 4 cancer, you know, recovering from that with Psyche's complete rebirth help, and then ending up at the same medical center I was at that I'd been treated at and doing the research project. But it had a big feeling to it. And I was very grateful to the doctors who were part of the study and allowed me to come in to do this. And what I was interested in, and talking with Von Franz about it at the time, I was interested in the motifs that show up that she had in her research in her book on dreams and death, and that Jung showed in his near-death experiences. And interestingly, most particularly, I was interested in the wedding of opposites. And so to watch the themes of the wedding up here, this became, I did a multiple regression study. So it looked at, you know, factors that would sort out people between two groups of people, the people that didn't have cancer, people that did have cancer, looking at their dreams, and did a multiple regression study on the factors in the dreams. And the people that were dying, the significance was off the charts compared to the people not dying of wedding themes. And so I'll give you one example from the study, which was so touching. It was an older man whose wife had died a year before, and he was getting closer to death. And his dream was that his wife came uh, in presence in a dream, and in the dream he was sitting in a church, and he goes, "I'm in a church, and I can feel my wife's presence." and I've got my foot on something. I'm rocking something, and I look down and I'm rocking back and forth. It's a cradle. Is it a baby that's in the cradle? Oh, it's my wife in her wedding dress, and I'm rocking her. And so he then, when he wakes up from the dream, he feels her presence. He feels the recent reality of her death. He feels her as his bride. He feels the comfort of being in touch with her, but he also felt that she was letting him know that this was another wedding that was about to get born, she and him yet again, that she was coming for him. And this is one of the themes that showed up again and again, is the dreams of those who've deceased showing up saying, I'm coming for you. One of the dreams was my ex-husband at the time. He went to see his father, who was dying, and his father's last dream to him that he spoke, and then he died hours later. He dreamt that his mother, sorry, let me make this clear. Howard is the man having the dream. Howard's wife, my ex-husband's mother, Howard's wife, Jan, came in the dream, and she said, Howard, time to pack a suitcase. We got quite a journey ahead. And then he died. The amount of dreams in the research that showed the deceased coming for the individual, making contact, and again, not believers, just a phenomenon, an archetypal truth phenomenon, is that they come for the one who's dying. So I'm going to show you an application of that in 1 second. And the other are the wedding motifs, that I'll tell you more about in a second. But let's get back to this. So let's take Tom's death process. Because the capacity for the psyche to inform the process and grow a process that creates amazing comfort is astounding. So it's the moment of death with Tom. And I'm very blessed to have been there and be able to share this. I knew that Tom was about to die. I could feel that it was coming soon. And I stayed up to meditate at his bedside, and he's laying on a couch in front of me, and I'm sitting in front of him. We had been, just so you get the picture here, we'd been, and it goes back to the research because this theme was in the research, and I knew to look for it, and I knew to help Tom with it. So this is what I'm also saying. So maybe listeners will use some of this too when they're helping someone die, because that theme about others coming for you is so strong and so archetypally true. So Tom loved life. He didn't want to leave life, and he went through a very long ordeal. So in his last hours of living, he's laying on the couch, and I say to him, Tom, I know you've been in a light coma, and I just want you to know something. And I think you can hear me. And I want you to know that if you want to die today, that your dear friend Paul will be with us, and he'll be here for your sons. But if you have to die tomorrow, Paul has to go. He can't stay. So it's okay. You can die any day you want, but just so you know. So Paul, who's sitting there, stands up with the two boys, walks out the door. They leave. They go to have breakfast. And Paul says, I'm going to go have breakfast. I'll be back in about an hour. Soon as the door shuts, Tom comes out of a coma. He sits straight up, and he looks at me and he says one word, ready. And then he starts to birth, like he's birthing himself. He's sitting up in an active birthing breath process. And I say to Tom, honey, been present at this a number of times, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's going to come that way, but you might want to try the other opposite. You might want to try receptivity. You might want to lay back. And then I was showing him a breath body exercise. Then let the inhalations go slow and deep. And then I said, which came from the research, Tom, you might want to look for who's coming for you. Tom laid back. He took 2 breaths, and a diamond pattern of light appeared in our field. A light blue crystal diamond, energetic, appeared in our field in the process as he had sat up. And then the moment that he laid back and he looked for who's coming for him, the diamond pattern turned and shifted over his body. So if I'm Tom, now the diamond's over my body. And with 2 gentle breaths, he left. It was like Ramana Maharshi. His death is similar. That a peaceful, a few breaths, no struggle, and gone. So in the research at the medical center, that motif of looking to see who's coming for you can create a very peaceful transition for people, and I hope that people will remember that. Another, as I said, the motif of the wedding was very constant in the dreams. There's so many motifs that happened. And in Tom's life, interestingly, Now, I wasn't going around talking about the research while he was dying, right? But it's the archetypal strata of the psyche. It's the reality of how the psyche is structured. It's structured around the conjunctio, the wedding of opposites. So, and that was Jung's great work, the Mysterium Conjunctionis. Jung kept saying, the psyche goes beyond duality into non-duality. That's the subtle body. And so, Tom, in his death process, he kept telling myself and his sons, I can feel a wedding that's calling me, but I don't want to go. I want to stay with you. And he would just hug us and hug us. He goes, but there's a wedding and it's really calling me and it wants me to go. So eventually, of course, the very last day, Tom was ready and he said, I'm going to be going off to my wedding. I can see it's going to happen. He made peace. Then he'd gone into this light coma and then he left through that diamond body experience. Now, I just want to say too, for listeners, and it's also so beautiful about my Tom in his death process, he shot so many parrots. So many pieces that would have been the false self just went by the wayside. Old structures from early psyche, old trauma body, early dynamics, everything just left his field and he was in unison with something greater, which birthed that diamond body. See, and that's a universal reality death wants to do with all of us. Tom just gave us the gift of showing it to us so we could drink at the well with him. But that's the archetypal nature. And the research was, the images in it, those are my two central, most important pieces. There were also, by the way, images of the journey. So that's the dream I mentioned of Howard. You're death seen as a journey. Get ready to get your suitcase packed. You're about to take off. You're going to cross the big water. Von Franz kept saying that you'll see river crossings. And yes, very often it was crossing a river to another side. So there were motifs of thresholds and initiation. Elements, the elementals also were stronger in the dreams of those dying, and the connection to fire and transformative fire and trying to get a relationship to fire was very strong motif. But I think it's the wedding of opposites that's the most important.
Can listeners find this research online anywhere and find your analysis, or is that something we won't be able to read?
I wish that I had it in a form that's readable. I'm actually working on that now, and since my life has emptied some space out, I can finally get to it.
Well,
So
fingers
I'll
crossed,
have it.
Monica. That sounds like an enormous resource for anybody interested, not only in dreams, but also in trying to get a sense of the best way to use all of this wealth of information coming through, both if we're supporting somebody or if we're facing it ourselves. It'd be an amazing resource. So do check the show notes, listeners. If Monica gets around to that in the next couple of years while the interview is still up, I will definitely add it.
Thanks.
So,
Appreciate it.
Monica, thank you for staying with us. Thank you for holding all of this on the air. Such important and difficult and extraordinary stuff. My last question is about afterwards. Once it's all over and your loved one has passed, what is the best way to mourn? Is there a sweet spot where we can sort of remember them and honor everything that that person meant to us, the effect they had in the world, without getting caught up in the attachment and the pain of separation? Is there a sweet spot? Did Jung give any advice on this? What's your advice to listeners who are mourning?
Well, first of all, you said so much in the way you asked the question that it practically answers it. That you do have to go through the attachment pieces and the struggle, but you're looking for where does the psyche want to create a sweet spot so that you don't drown in grief, so that grief informs new life, so that there's a rebirth. There's oftentimes a pregnancy that comes out of a death process. And if I think the challenge, I guess I would say, is that grief for everyone it will take you into who you are. And so if you're an avoider, you'll avoid the grief. And what will that do? It will compartmentalize it, and that's not healthy for yourself or anyone around you. So some people are avoidant, and so they won't open to the reality of grief. And that's sad because the reality of grief is a living process that absolutely renews and revivifies. And it takes you on quite a journey, as people know. Many of your listeners have been through deep grief, they've gone through it, but it's good to speak to it because it is its own animal, and you're right to have us take a look at it in the closing. The chance for individuation to happen in those of us who are left after someone dies is so enormous. And to get the time and the space, watch your dreams, stay with your feeling states, work to leave room, let it keep breaking through, let the tears keep coming, the weeping, the missing. Oftentimes it's animal missing that comes in, like, for example, with a partner like Tom and I, so powerfully connected, and he's so young, he's only 58, the animal body missing with your favorite mammal, you got to just stay with the process. You can't cut that off, but it will turn into something and it will keep transforming, it'll keep transforming. And so, for example, like when my sister died, is another story, and there's another archetypal motif for people when you go through loss, and that is that if you haven't served the person well, you will feel regret. And the regret, I felt that very much with my sister, my older sister. I felt like, wow, I didn't get a chance. And so to know her and really have the soul communion I wanted with her. But she did it after death. For a year, she stayed. So some people will get a grief process where you get dreams and presence of the person for a very long time while something's getting worked out in a grief process. So it's rich. You don't want to miss it. The sweet spot absolutely comes. I guess what I would say is you're going to suffer a lot of deaths yourself. You'll also get tangled up in your own pathology if you, get tangled in sorrow, if you get tangled in fusion. You got to get some help because you don't want to have it go into a depressive cycle and where you don't want to live. That can happen to people. Vortexes inside the grief process can appear, and they're natural. And you just reach out and have human contact, and you can find your way right back out of them because something else wants to happen. Is that, like I mentioned, that dream of the passage tomb where you don't know in your own life what's going to be the next part of the story. Psyche wants to inform something rich. And that's why I again say Wendell Berry's poems on death are brilliant, because he's telling us the death is a sort of grave, and we become like a tree, he says, over the grave. And these deaths inform new ground for us that we draw new energy from. So our connection with the greater self increases hugely. And also the psyche of us changes. You want life to go slow. There's also a vastness of time and space that opens up. You can't stand, as Yeats would say, at stroke of midnight, the soul cannot endure mental or bodily furniture. You can't stand the things the way life's populated. You need space and quiet to let something unfurl so you can feel the soul of yourself and the soul of the other person and soul realities. So it's a sacred time. You want to give yourself time. I say if it's someone significant in your life, give yourself at least a year. I'd say 13 months, because from what I've seen in people's processes, it's oftentimes, and it was with my sister, my grandmother, it's oftentimes a 13th month process. But see how also that person wants to inform your life, that their presence wants to stay in heart contact. Um, when at the end of the grief process that I held a carrying bridge site for Tom Elsner, and Tom wrote on it, and we both did our dreams and things in the whole process. And it ended, I closed it with a dream, which just tells us about grief. And in the dream, and I ended the site with this last dream recording. And in the dream, it was everybody who'd loved Tom, who'd participated in the shared field of loving Tom and the way their death had impacted them, that their own psychic metal had been challenged and changed. Their own alchemical metal had been wrought. They'd gone through something. They'd created something in themselves by going through the grief process. I know the service was 6 months later than his death. So anyway, in the dream, everybody had a piece of metal that had been wrought in their own process. And those pieces of metal, to our surprise, created a field phenomenon, a beautiful heart-shaped open window. And it was, as the alchemists would say, a finestra aeternatus, a window to eternity. And that window to eternity of the heart field that we all shared in the co-creation of creates an energetic communion with Tom in the beyond, and Tom's communion with us through the heart. So new transmutations in the psyche want to be born, and our love and our lives and everyone's part of it, our dreams, with new ways of living in life and in death, and new ways of feeling community, feeling connection with the eternal and with those we love. So new births want to come out of it. And I find that infinitely valuable and interesting. And I spend my life parked there at that well. So I think people who are grieving, you don't want to miss out on what can grow that would be brand new. If you get stuck, get help.
Well, Monika Wikman, it leaves me just to thank you so much for sharing so many decades of research, of experience, of knowledge of people going through these things. And I do hope, listeners, that this has been as valuable for you as it has been for me. Certainly has helped me in my mourning process. And Lots to think about. Monika Wikman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Freddie, so much for having me and allowing me to unfurl all this. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.